it rains once a year, and all that water is captured in these cisterns, and this is the little field that where they are able to grow something. Now, finally, if we are thinking about coping with drought, we never would think about Holland. And even in Holland, they are developing this kind of projects of history of science and environmental history to tackle with the future. And they are rescuing these water-saving practices. Now, this is an unbelievable story because it rains not every day, but 3 times a day. And still, in the Dutch, in the 17th century, they were building a cistern in front of each house. Sometimes they wouldn't use it for a year, and the water was not good anymore. But they were saving water. Everybody was saving water. So I think also, even if in the past, in Holland, they were having these water-saving practices, I think we have a lot to learn with these lessons that come from the past. So, final remarks, but which are, in fact, opening remarks for a new future, okay? So I just hope that this is a window for the future. So traditional, historic, indigenous food systems can contribute to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. This is already a global trend. And also, water-saving practices reuse water and the expertise of effort when every drop counted. Okay, this is already also a more or less global trend. And so this is looking at the history of science and technology for more sustainable solutions. So thank you so much. And this session is over. I think I'm on time. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much indeed. How very good for us to hear of practical and important ways of using history of science to tackle the future. Thank you, Ana. So we're going to turn now to our colleague from South Korea, Jongtae Lim, who is a professor of East Asian science in the program for the history and philosophy of science. We are going to hear from him about historiographical reflections. Thank you so much. Jongtae, over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for a kind introduction. And hello, everyone. It's my great honor to present in this Global History of Science Festival. I am here on behalf of the International Society for the History of Science in East Asia, which is the East Asia Commission of DHST. For the discipline of the history of science, the 20th century was marked by the simultaneous occurrence of 2 seemingly contradictory phenomena. On one hand, the historical narratives of Western science, which supported the belief in the universality of modern Western science, gained global hegemony. On the other hand, the 20th century also witnessed the growth of the historical studies of science in non-Western regions and countries. One of the prime examples of the regional history of science would be the history of East Asian science, which I am currently representing. The coexistence of these two currents created a fundamental tension within the historiography of science in non-Western regions. This tension arises from the question of where to position science in non-Western regions within a historiographical framework where modern Western science holds global hegemony. In the case of the history of East Asian science, it is also a question of how to establish the relationship between science and East Asia. If science is regarded a product of the Western civilization, then East Asia, which seemingly did not independently develop it, finds itself in a contradictory relationship with it. My presentation today aims to illustrate how some of the leading scholars in this field during the 20th century address the underlying tension inherent in the history of East Asian science. This will provide an opportunity to reflect on some of the historiographical challenges that continue to confront the history of East Asian science today. First, let me provide a brief overview of the development of the field in the 20th century. The field of the history of East Asian science found its footing in the mid-20th century, thanks to scattered groups of researchers who specialized in the history of traditional Chinese science. Beyond China's border, notable figures such as Yabuchi Kiyoshi in Japan, Joseph Needham in Britain, and Needham and Sivin in the United States played pivotal roles. This loosely connected network grew more interconnected during the 1960s and 70s as it welcomed historians of Japanese and Korean science. Noteworthy examples include Nakayama Shigeru in Japan and Jeon Sangwoon in Korea. The network then embarked on a path of institutionalization. In 1975, Needham and Sivin of the United States founded a journal titled Chinese Science as a platform for scholarly exchanges among researchers in the field. In 1982, the first international conference on the history of science in China was held in Louvain, Belgium. In 1990, the International Society for the History of Science in East Asia was established, with Chinese Science serving as the official journal of the society. Throughout the 1990s, the society convened its international conferences in Kyoto, Seoul, and Singapore, significantly boosting the involvement of researchers from the regions beyond China. Concurrently, studies on modern science, including the scientific exchanges between Europe and East Asia since the early modern period, as well as the relationship between science and Japanese empire, gained momentum. In sum, by the 1990s, the society had evolved to encompass not only pre-modern China, but also the past and present of science in broader East Asia. This process of the emergence of the history of East Asian science shows that the concept of East Asia is not self-evident. The spatial and temporal boundaries of East Asia have evolved, extending from China to encompass the surrounding countries, and from pre-modern science to encompass modern science from the late 19th century onward. The expansion of the field's spatial and temporal scope presented complex historiographical challenges. Temporally, the expansion clashed with the distinction between tradition and modernity that underpins the hegemony of modern Western science. Spatially, it overlaid the issues of cultural hierarchy between China and its smaller neighbors onto the existing dichotomy between China and the West. From now on, I will examine how three eminent historians of the field in the late 20th century responded to the historiographical issues in the history of East Asian science. They are Joseph Needham, Needham and Sivin, and Jeon Sangwoon. With the first two historians of Chinese science, I will illustrate two competing strategies for positioning Chinese science in relation to modern Western science. Then, through the work of Jeon Sangwoon on the history of traditional Korean science, I will explore the problematic nature of the concept of East Asia. Joseph Needham and Needham and Sivin are arguably the foremost figures in the study of Chinese science within Western academia in the second half of the 20th century. Despite adopting distinct and at times conflicting approaches to the history of Chinese science, they share two fundamental characteristics. First, both aim to establish the unique position of Chinese science in relation to modern Western science. Second, in pursuit of this objective, they drew upon the specific trends within the historiography of Western science. What set them apart were the types of historiography of Western science they each relied upon. While Joseph Needham drew upon the Marxist socio-economic history of science, Needham and Sivin turned to the intellectualist interpretation of the European scientific revolution, which emerged as a critique of the former and held a prominent position from the mid to late 20th century. Joseph Needham is best known for his efforts to uncover the great achievement of the pre-modern Chinese science. He firmly believed in the universality of science, asserting that science is in all civilized regions of the world, including China, was progressing towards the universal destination of the modern science. However, he acknowledged that it was Europe at the time of Galileo that first transitioned from traditional science to modern science. This gave rise to the famous "Why not in China" question that guided his grand project titled Science and Civilization in China. That is, why did modern science not emerge in China? This does not mean that Needham considered Chinese science an inferior precursor to modern Western science. Instead, he viewed Chinese science as having achieved original and even more progressive milestones when compared to their Western counterparts. The core of his perspective lay in his broader conception of modern science, extending well beyond the boundaries of modern Western science. According to him, in contrast to the mechanically oriented modern Western science, China developed a distinct science with a more organismic nature. However, it is important to note that these alternative possibilities within Chinese science, in the ultimate sense, do not diminish Western science, but rather anticipate non-mainstream, anti-mechanical tendencies within Western scientific thoughts. Needham and Sivin, in contrast, did not embrace Needham's teleological view of modern science. Instead, he focused on examining how natural knowledge and its investigation existed differently within a distinct intellectual and social context in China. To illustrate the disparity between Western and Chinese science, Sivin drew upon the resources of the intellectualist interpretation of the scientific revolution prevalent in the late 20th century history of Western science. The only difference is Sivin translated the temporal transformation within the Western science from medieval Aristotelian to modern mechanical worldview into a cultural contrast between China and the West. Nevertheless, much like Joseph Needham, Sivin's characterization of Chinese science did not imply complete separation from modern Western science. He did not entirely rule out the possibility of temporal transformation in Chinese science. According to him, Western science had already influenced China since the early modern period, resulting in changes that were intellectually similar but significantly limited in their social cultural impact compared to their European counterparts. In other words, Western science was regarded as the catalyst for the scientific transformation that would occur in modern China. If Needham and Sivin showed their historiographical reliance on the history of Western science, their Korean colleague Jeon Sangwoon delved into science in China's cultural periphery, thereby highlighting the complex nature of the concept of East Asia. Stimulated by Needham's Science and Civilization in China, Jeon Sangwoon published his 1966 monograph titled A History of Science and Technology in Korea. This marked a significant shift in the historiography of Korean science. Unlike earlier Korean writers who assessed the traditional Korean science in comparison to modern Western science, Jeon Sangwoon adopted Chinese science, which heavily influenced Korean science, as the basis for comparison. He then sought to understand how Korean science maintained its cultural and scientific identity amid the dominance of Chinese metropolitan science. His conclusion was that scientists in pre-modern Korea successfully adapted to the introduced Chinese science to suit Korea's natural environment and social needs. Jeon Sangwoon's placement of Korean science at the periphery of Chinese science seems natural when describing a nation's scientific development. However, it poses a challenging issue when conceptualizing science of a broader region known as East Asia, to which Korea belonged alongside China and its other neighbors. Needham's and Sivin's narrative of Chinese science positions the West as the frame of reference for evaluating Chinese science, while Jeon Sangwoon's history of Korean science places China in the role typically assigned to the West. In other words, there was a disparity in perspectives between the two historiographies. This divergent focus of historians made it difficult for them to engage in a productive dialogue that could lead to the development of a common field of research with shared methodological focus. This problem becomes more pronounced when applied to the modern period. Korean historians no longer regard China as the primary reference point for evaluating Korean science. Indeed, during the 20th century, the sources of advanced science for Korea was shifted from China to Japan and later the United States, and Korean scientists now face the task of adapting Western science to meet its own local needs. Modern Korean science lacks compelling reason to be regarded as part of East Asian science, aside from its geographical location. How then have these issues evolved and what the prospect for the future may be? The aforementioned historiographical problems in the history of East Asian science can be attributed in large part to the underlying Eurocentric and nationalist assumptions in the historiography of East Asian science. These historiographical pitfalls have been largely overcome since the 1990s, thanks to the decline of European Eurocentric historical narrative of the scientific revolution and the emergence of new perspectives to understand the relationship between Western and non-Western societies, such as post-colonial criticism and global history. Finally, the rise of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese science since the latter half of the 20th century has made East Asia one of the most scientific, vibrant regions in the world. All these factors contributed to weakening the perception of a fundamental contradiction between science and East Asia. However, this does not completely resolve the problems associated with the concept of East Asian science as outlined above. The inertia of previous historiographical practices and the resulting mismatches in historiographical perspective persists. Studies of Chinese science continue to primarily focus on comparisons with or interactions with Chinese science. Similarly, the growing scholarship on contemporary Korean science often uses American science as its comparative frame of reference or historical origin. This enduring problem suggests that there are social cultural forces aside from Eurocentrism and nationalism hindering the fruitful interconnection of histories of science in East Asian countries, a question to which I currently don't have a clear answer. However, science in Asia, whether during pre-modern times, when Chinese science exerted overwhelming influence over its neighboring countries, or in modern times, when the entire region evolved into a global center for science, offers intriguing cases for examination as an interconnected entity. I believe that the history of science in East Asia presents a fertile ground for exploration, one that can reward the dedicated researchers with exciting outcomes. The challenge lies in researchers seizing this opportunity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. What an interesting talk you have given us, and how important it is for you to articulate the problems that you see in order for us to move ahead, to move forward, exactly as we're trying to do with our discussions about the how to use history of science and technology in the future or for the future. So thank you. That was a very, very fascinating and significant talk. We have some time now for discussion, but I also wish to move to our third speaker, Professor Simões, Ana Simões, who's the professor in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Lisbon, but is also speaking to us particularly today because she has been nominated by the European Society for the History of Science and has a fascinating title, When Centers and Peripheries Meet, Global History, the Art of the Fugue. So please, Ana.
So thank you so much for this nice introduction. I will now share my screen. And so let me do it. This is a different way of sharing the screen than usual, so it will take me a bit more time. I think that you are seeing me now, right? So let me then thank very much Janet Browne, thank all the organizers for this wonderful festival. I mean, it's probably the first time in the history of our disciplines that we have such a festival enrolling people from so many different scholars from so many different parts of the world. And again, following my colleague who just spoke before me, I will enroll in some historiographical considerations based on past experience, but also projecting them to the future. And in fact, these goes back to reflections within a group which was called Science and Technology in the European Free, but also within the European Society for the History of Science. And it's also part of a metaphor which I have been putting forward together with a colleague and friend, Maria Paula Diogo, in a volume which will come out very soon, which is called The New Cambridge History of Science and Technology, edited by Francesca Bray, Dagmar Scheffer, Tiago Saraiva, and Matteo Valeriani. As we all know, different notions of centers and peripheries have been used in history of science and technology since Basal's model of the diffusion of knowledge from metropolitan centers to colonial peripheries. And all of them build on a clear dichotomy: creativity of centers, passivity, and peripheries. But following Basal's model, for example, a scholar such as Bruno Latour concentrated himself on how centers emerge, and he said that they happen through the mediation of cycles of accumulation in a process of co-construction of places as centers and other places as peripheries. But after global history has asserted itself as a new historiographical paradigm, privileging the connectedness of the world as its analytical point of departure, the fact is that scholars have largely discarded the notions of centers and peripheries as inadequate to describe encounters and negotiations among actors taken to have equivalent agencies. They, in fact, were against the idea of a dominant voice governing exchange. These studies emphasize that knowledge exchange always involved many actors and the polyphony of voices. In what follows, what I want to discuss is how can we still use the notion of centers and peripheries, but as tools that fully reveal the imbalances that shape entangled histories, not only between Europe and the rest of the world, but within Europe itself. I thus am stressing here power asymmetries by refusing to level out the agency of all actors, as in a polyphonic composition that produces, in my view, the fallacious impression of flat power hierarchies. In truth, from this perspective, the relations between centers and peripheries follow the classical compositional technique of the fugue, as in Bach, art of the fugue. Although we can discern a common dominant theme that is stated loud and clear, each voice is able to complement the subject differently through inversions, augmentations, exactly like the creative processes of appropriation that interact inside a constellation of asymmetric power relations. In approaching in this way the narratives of exchange between actors, it is clear that circulation, appropriation, interaction, negotiation, rather than diffusion, are embedded in all contacts between different actors, whether peaceful or violent. Although power hierarchies are nowadays mainly associated with colonial and imperial studies, that they certainly have shaped forms of exchange, including those which have taken place within Europe itself. In Voltaire's words, for example, traveling to Spain and Portugal in the 18th century embodied a contact with the other, the barbarian, as exotic to him as the Niger tribes were for the explorer Mungo Park, for example. And for 19th century Western Europeans, traveling eastward from Budapest was as radical an adventure as penetrating the African hinterland. The former examples show that centers and peripheries have been categories used by historical actors, although they may not name them as such. In fact, they have been used by historical actors. But here, I want to move beyond these categories as historical ones to explore their potential as analytical tools. The relations the relationships established through science and technology are never unidirectional, and so the concept of passive recipients has to give way to science and technological agents in their own right, able to convey and negotiate alternative forms of knowledge. Yet, even when we embrace a co-construction knowledge perspective, scholars, in my view, often convey an often too idyllic, almost romanticized view of the relationship between European powers and between distinctly European and non-European worldviews. What I mean is that they tend to overshadow tensions and opposing interests between different strategies of acquiring and consolidating power. To give an example, there was an asymmetric relationship in cases where Portuguese scientists and engineers traveled within Europe, for example, to the Jardin des Plantes or to the École des Ponts et Chaussées in Paris, or to Germany, to the Freiberg Mining School, or also in an imperial context when local elites negotiated instances of imperial politics with metropolitan centers. Although the first case deals with soft power, non-coercive forms of imposing specific values, and the other one has to do with hard power, nonetheless, both equally illustrate instances of unbalanced negotiations. And so I propose to use Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony to analyze the role science and technology play in these kinds of interactions, both within Europe and between Europe and other parts of the world. Cultural hegemony is at the core of the process that created, so to speak, European hegemony by transforming, for example, technology as a techne, from a techne, an art, to an episteme, a way of knowing. This episteme became hegemonic from the 16th century onwards, and it is, of course, based on idea of progress that can be traced through Bacon, Descartes, and Kant. That is an idea of controlling and dominating nature through science and technology to achieve an improved stage of development of growth. On a global scale, European-driven science and technology act simultaneously as instances of hegemony and dominance, using both persuasion and coercion to impose the perspectives and interests of centers both within and beyond Europe. In this globalized world, the concept of center and periphery become useful analytical tools because they translate into an unbalanced distribution of power among actors. They justify and grant rights and opportunities to some while downgrading or excluding others. Because these positions are vectors of power, not moral assumptions, the center periphery is never neutral and it changes across time and space. Furthermore, this binary allows historians to empower and differentiate peripheries. There is not one periphery, but various peripheries. There is not one center, but various centers. There is not a global north, but various. There is not a global south, but various global souths, each with different agendas and deploying different strategies in both time and place. The center-periphery distinction does so by making audible the voice of vectors who perceived themselves as being so the center-periphery agenda, the center-periphery distinction does so by making audible the voice of actors who perceive themselves as being peripheral, digging into their perspectives, justifications, and agendas, instead of imposing a narrative that overshadows, dissolves, washes out, or erases the discourse of the peripheries. Peripheries are not inefficient, defective centers. On the contrary, they have their own identities built on their collaborative and/or confrontational relationship with the centers. By acknowledging these identities, the role of power asymmetries is stressed in designing the possible scenarios of appropriation in different geographic and political contexts, and also in highlighting the function of the binary circulation and appropriation as means of producing knowledge while accentuating the multiple frictions or resistances that take place in this process. This shift in our point of view as historians is what I mean when invoking the fugue as a metaphor for writing history about centers and peripheries. Accordingly, what is proposed now is that going away from center-periphery as a linear model of center dominance, periphery dependency, while retaining a dimension of analysis attuned to power. Only by acknowledging the existence of hierarchical interactions does it become possible to understand, evaluate, and make visible the specific strategies designed by peripheral actors to optimize their capital of knowledge on both a national and an international scale. The term polyphony has been used widely to describe the global history approach to plurality, building on an assumption that actors have equivalent agencies. Using the same musical metaphor, the Baselian center-periphery model would be described as a monophony, in which the melody of the center is dominant in imposing its pattern on all the others as the only one acceptable. Still, following the same musical metaphor, the narrative I'm suggesting here is based on a non-Baselian framework of centers and peripheries described as a structure akin to the fugue, in which, although there is a common dominant theme, each voice states the subject at a different rhythm independent and a different independent melody, similarly to the creative processes of appropriation interacting inside the constellation of asymmetric power relations. Just as the fugue is considered the most complex of contrapuntal forms in combining restrictions and freedom, so does the center-periphery model, qua art of the fugue, offer historians of science and technology a complex and dynamic topography of circulation and appropriation of knowledge, objects and practices, shaped by different and ever-changing instances of power. It gives voice to the peripheries, acknowledging the multiple and diverse ways they have designed their own agency and their own strategies in an uneven landscape of global power. And I hope that in order to finish my presentation, I will invite you to listen to 2 minutes of the Kunst der Fuge, Contrapunctus 13, performed by Kimiko Ishizaka, with an animated graphical score. It's just 2 minutes.
Anna, thank you. Will you be saying more about this delightful piece?
No, I mean, not really.
No.
I've been using as really, I mean, as a metaphor to how I think we can still keep both centers and peripheries and within a global world. And this applies as well as for our past actors as ourselves as professionals, historians of science, I think.
Well, thank you. That's a very compelling use of evidence here. And as an extremely engaging and important framework that you're offering. So thank you very much for your talk. So thank you all three. We've had some very thoughtful issues raised here. We have a couple of questions that have come in on the chat, but if any of our Zoom listeners wish to raise a question, please could you type it into the chat box, which you will, the Q&A box that you will find along the bottom of your screen. And we have one question from Lisa Winters that is about the center and periphery model, but maybe all three of you might wish to chime in on this. It's such an interesting approach, your approach, and you mentioned that there are, of course, many centers and many peripheries, but one can imagine a center within one context would be a periphery in another context. And how would this work if one was trying to make a larger, more global history? Have you any thoughts on this? The relationships are always shifting, basically.
Yeah, okay. It's true that these centers and peripheries are changing in time, are changing in place. They also change in subject. For example, Uppsala could be a center for pneumatic chemistry in the 18th century and wouldn't be for any other subject, for example. So this is precisely what we want to take into consideration. And this is also something that you can take into consideration in the context of a globalized, connected world. Because what really this means is that in this new context, the interactions between localities or between actors are changing, but they are changing in a way in which not of them have equal agency. And so these agencies are also changing, and they are, some of them are dominant in some times, others are dominant in others. So I don't think, thank you very much for your comment, but I really think that we can integrate precisely this time-wise definition of centers and peripheries within a globalized world, because exactly this is about power relations and the symmetries that evolve in time, in place, in subject, for example.
Thank you. And we had another question on the chat, which Jongtae has in fact answered in type. But I wonder if I could repeat the question and we could hear for the other listeners what was asked, which was that it was in relation to Professor Lim's talk, Jongtae's talk. Does the history of science need to have a standard of comparison in order to be researched? Could it not be studied in the context of other fields that are not science? And you gave a rather interesting answer. I wonder if you would like to recapitulate that.
Okay, thank you for your question. I wrote very briefly the answer for your question, but so my answer was that the problem you pointed out are more pronounced in the history of science, in which people just believe that science is universal and value neutral, but some regions of the world achieve this universal status of science more than any other countries. So the countries or regions that are classified as the periphery or the less advanced place of the world, they tended to compare or assess that the scientific achievements in compare to the advanced region of science, the center of the science, which are regarded as embodying the universal status of science. That is more pronounced in industrial science. Yeah, of course, I think you're right. We can examine science, not comparing with some standard, but in context of social. In context of culture or the other social relations, but the 20th century, later 20th century, the history of science is still in the stage of that kind of, the comparison between the universal centers and then some periphery. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. And there's a question for Ana Rodrigues, that perhaps, since we're thinking a little about the centers and peripheries, your talk very explicitly drew in the knowledge of people who one might think of as being marginalized in the past. So I wonder if some of the work that you are recommending for us to do and that you are so powerfully doing it yourself is about bringing to public knowledge information and knowledge of nature that has been marginalized, been suppressed, or at least put to one side.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make a question. I'm just going to answer your question, but I wanted to make a question and I couldn't write it. And then, okay, that's why I raised my hand. That's it. But I will do it after. So yes, in fact, I think the problem was after the Industrial Revolution, as there were so much more technological inputs, everything that was done in the past, or the way they did in the past, was just left behind. They thought it was not interesting anymore. And nowadays, it's the opposite, because as we are having so many problems in the planet, in fact, due to this excessive use of technology and, in fact, production, we want to recover practices that, in fact, used much less technology, and not only technology, but also chemicals, also energy. So when people did not have anything of that, and they still could grow and feed themselves. Of course, the amount of production is usually lower, but nowadays there are some movements like the Campesina in Brazil and all that they say they produce much more per hectare. So, but in fact, it's a general trend. It's a global trend. So in every place in these two fields of farming and water management, people are institutions and also researchers. They are looking to the past to search for new solutions that are in fact more sustainable and more healthy, also regarding food security. So what I wanted to ask, sorry if I may,
has to be very tiny.
Very tiny. It was in fact to Ana and Lim, because this relationship between centers and peripheries, for example, we Europeans, when we are here, and especially in Portugal, we are always, okay, yes, we are the periphery, the centers are France, United Kingdom, Germany. And now when we listen to these talks, for example, for Lim, when he talks about Europe, he doesn't talk about these countries that we think are the centers. So he talks about Europe, and then of course, and then the peripheries are the other continents. So I just wanted maybe you both to, because you never think about, they don't talk about France or the United Kingdom is Europe. And in fact, in Europe, there are many of us that also were peripheries for a long time. So I would like to see if you wanted to comment on this. I think we don't have time, but well, sorry. It would be interesting.
perhaps I could exercise my privilege as chair and say that I think in a way, the way you posed the question has brought it to our attention, and that we perhaps don't quite have time to respond to it. But thank you for posing that question so eloquently. I want to thank all three of you for very provocative and helpful talks. It's very thoughtful, and that is a wonderful way for us to end our 24 hours of conference. So I am extremely grateful to you. I hope you have not been up all these 24 hours listening to all the other talks, but congratulations if you have. It's my honor to be able to say thank you to all the speakers and organizers who have participated in bringing this to life. We've had 57 speakers, possibly a couple more since I had the numbers given to me, from 37 countries around the world. And as you perhaps will know, we have gone from time zone to time zone to time zone around the world. It's a global festival. And for the Division for the History and Science of Technology, for the people who are currently on the council there and the officers there, it's been tremendously important and moving for us to imagine that we are re-establishing connectivity, that we are hopefully trying to bring together the commissions through you as representatives and through our listeners. It's important that we should all try to cultivate values that are the values are much the same throughout our community. And I think for the sessions that I've been hearing, that we all have much to say to each other, and that this technological marvel of being on the internet around the world is going to facilitate this for the future. So thank you. And I'm speaking here now to anybody who is still listening to us, that this is our last formal session. We have one more session of discussion, which will be chaired by Thomas Haddad. And I'd like to take this moment just to say how much Thomas has done to bring this into life. So thank you, Thomas. He's not listening now, I doubt, but we are all very grateful to him. He will be getting the next session ready, I'm sure. And I think it's also very important that we should acknowledge the extremely hard work that has been done on our behalf by the young people from the British Society of the History of Science who have been our technological support. And I'd like to name them, please. Particularly, Sam Robinson has been extraordinarily helpful in setting up the system. And we have also a team of young scholars led by Sam, who have been Megan, Grace, Daniela, Alexander, and Sarah. And we thank you very sincerely for what you've been doing. So it's my duty to end this session. We will be closed without any further ado. And I hope that you will have the time and the energy to come into the final session, session 22, which will be a discussion of both what we've been through in the last 24 hours together and on some of the policies that we're trying to bring forward for the division in the next several months. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. And
thank you, Janet.
Good night, good morning, good afternoon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.